In his writings, Pope Francis acknowledges divisions and difficulty to reconcile, but he gives us hope. He says that if we trust, if we listen to one another, and if we humbly come together trying to do the good, then we can succeed. He gives a beautiful image. He describes the difficulties, how we can be confined or held back by our attitudes. He describes them as a river held in place by the banks. But there is the potential that that water can break through the barriers, and it can flow and bring new life, and for us, bring new visions. That word overflow has a very special meaning for Pope Francis. He gives it a spiritual meaning, and he describes it as in Psalm 23. We think of the abundant love of God that makes our cups overflow. Or the prodigal son was embraced by the overflowing love of a father. It could be the love that washes the feet of the apostles when Jesus pours water over their feet at the Last Supper. So overflow is a fruit and also a gift, a grace, when we follow what God calls us to do. I was visiting the Holy Land and went to a beautiful new church on the shores of Lake Galilee at the excavations of Magdala. And in the church, there's a glass wall behind the altar. So looking at the altar, you'll see the lake that is very close. It's very, very beautiful. The name of this church is Put Out into the Deep. That's the name. We know that Jesus used the boat of Peter to preach to the people when they gathered around him on the lake. When our Lord finished preaching, he said to Peter, "Put out into the deep." And the gospel tells us that the fishermen had fished all night and they caught nothing. However, Peter says to Jesus, "I will do that, yes." And as they fish, they pull in the nets and they're breaking. Literally, there is an overflow of fish. And some of those fishermen follow Jesus. This beautiful church that is on the lake is dedicated to the women of Galilee. Their names are on 8 pillars surrounding the baptismal font. One of the pillars says simply, "Many other women." So knowing that there are more than just those who we have named in the gospel. But there's also a blank pillar. And we were told that the pillar with no inscription is there for the women of today, the women of all ages who have continued to minister to Jesus in the suffering and the poor. So the women of Galilee, we know, followed our Lord. They followed our Lord even to Calvary and stood there. And so do women of today. These women put out into the deep. There is another woman who lived on the lake. We do not know her name, but we call her the Syrophoenician. So she was not one of the women of Galilee, but lived on the other side of the lake, in the area that was not Jewish. And there's a beautiful story in the scriptures of this woman who put out into the deep. She was brave enough to come before our Lord and risk being humiliated or rejected, and to bring to the Lord a request for her daughter, who is very ill. We see her at the end of the story, I believe, full of laughter, of joy, and tremendous gratitude, because our Lord would have said to her, "My friend, what you are asking me to do, I have already done for you." And in our first reading today, we meet Abraham. What a great example of the overflow of God's love. He put out into the deep. He followed where God called him from his home. He wandered in the wilderness as if in the darkness. And in the end, we know he is filled with God's overflow. Well, our gospel today takes place on the Feast of Tabernacles. Israel celebrating the story of the Exodus, their great experience, the honeymoon in the desert, and their desire to capture again in their lives the intimacy of God who was so close to them in those days. Although they were days of turmoil and not always of agreement, indeed. Now, John tells us and shows us in his gospel, by placing Jesus doing his miracles at this time and his teaching, these are said so often in the feast days. The reason being that Jesus is going to be for John the fulfillment of the longing of Israel, to fulfill what the feast days are celebrating. And so in the Feast of Tabernacles, this was a feast where water flowed abundantly in a land of scarce water, but water was thrown over the altar, poured down the steps of the temple in abundance. At night, Jerusalem was all lit up with candles, but even beyond that, all of the hills around the city, they all were aglow, and the writings say it was a beautiful thing to behold, all lit up. But there's one very interesting ritual that was done on the Feast of Tabernacles. The priests of the temple would go out the eastern gate of the city of Jerusalem, and they would go out before sunrise. They would face the east, and just as the sun broke the horizon, they would turn around with their backs to the sun and face the sanctuary in the temple. And here is their prayer. Our fathers in this place turned their backs toward the temple and worshiped the sun toward the east. But as for us, our eyes are turned toward the Lord. A very beautiful profession of faith that they're making there. John gives us the words of Jesus, I am the living water. And very soon from the cross, Jesus is going to say, I thirst. But it is for all of us that Christ, who is the living water, thirsts. And also, as on the Feast of Tabernacles, there were all the lights around Jerusalem. So Jesus says that I am the light of the world. And although the priests looked to the temple to pray, hidden from their view, behind that temple, from where they would have stood, Jesus will be raised up on the cross to draw all people to himself. So the days of Lent now draw to a conclusion. Listen to the grace to put out into the deep, to experience the overflow of God's love for you.